So, hi everyone, quick question. Who here knows what Bitcoin is? Okay, that's pretty good. Who here knows what blockchain is? Okay, I can leave then. Fantastic. So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm going to go through a little bit of the concept of how blockchain fits in with digital disruption. So I'm not going to look at blockchain within financial services. And one of the main things that we do at the Centre in London is do interdisciplinary research. So what we're trying to do is look at its impact outside of financial services, not just around Bitcoin, but more broadly. So on supply chains, manufacturing, all of these big kind of other industries that are out there. So digital transformation, and I'm sure you've heard this quite a few times during the conference, but basically it's something that's been going on since the 1960s. We've got digitalization, which has sort of happened with the advent of the computers. Datafication, does everyone know what datafication is? No, okay, so that is what business schools call the IoT revolution. So it's the datafication of objects and things combined with digitalization, which gives us a sort of disruption of our economy. Also our society and other parts of the economy, as one of the speakers was talking about this morning. And we've been looking quite a lot at something that we call data and information value chains. This is an example of one that we did with Ericsson together in 2014. And this is how data from sensors in different parts of the value chain in utilities comes together to give us a new type of supply chain, one that is driven by data and one that is, fueled by data. So I was at a conference, I was at South by Southwest doing some presentations over the last couple of days, and my favourite quote is, "Data is the new bacon." So everyone wants bacon, everyone now wants data. So this is just an example. I won't go into too much detail, but there's a number of reports where you can look at these value chains in more detail if it's interesting. So, we're looking at a complete redefinition of the economy, transport, retail, financial services, media, broadcast, even food and agriculture, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has been very rapidly transformed and disrupted by how we can now use digital technologies. So we have farmers in the United States who basically no longer have control over how they're actually putting seeds into the ground, because the seed companies have very detailed maps of their farms, and they tell them where to put it. It's a very interesting shift. So we've had a lot of growing interest in blockchain, and initially it was released in about 2008. Bitcoin came out in about 2008, and it was really sort of a niche thing. It was a hobbyist idea of creating digital currency, which is going to replace the central bank. But in about 2012, what we saw was a rapid change from interest in Bitcoin to blockchain, where people realized that it's not actually the digital currency that is the big breakthrough or the big disruption here. It's actually the underlying consensus protocol that gives us blockchain. So you can see, these are just Google searches, you can see quite rapidly take up. In about 2013, 2014, blockchain basically takes over, and we end up with about 1.1 billion investment into venture capital. So the perspective that we're taking at the Centre is that blockchain is the final drop in a wave of digital disruption. And we think that blockchain is actually helping some of these other digital technologies to completely disrupt. A big one is IoT. So for us, blockchain helps you give integrity and trust in your data as it flows along a digital supply chain. And that, as some people have mentioned previously, is an extremely important part of the digital economy. So it can help us redefine how we do identity management, for example. So the United Nations, through ID 2020, is investigating how blockchain will help provide digital identity for all the people today who don't have birth certificates across the world. It's actually a huge problem, proving identity, improving your right to access to services as a citizen of multiple different nations. That's hugely difficult for many, many people. It enables peer-to-peer commerce and finance. So this is actually a fundamental challenge to the manner in which we organize our economy. Traditionally, since the industrial economy, we've had economies of scale and scope, which means that companies act as agglomeration points of labor and capital. Blockchain allows individuals to work together in a very dynamic manner, in a different type of supply chain. It also completely reconfigures traditional supply chains. The manner in which data is shared across supply chains can be completely transformed by blockchain. And there's some other very, very interesting work that's been done around state-backed fiat cryptocurrencies. So a fiat cryptocurrency is basically putting a pound sterling onto a cryptocurrency distribution mechanism, which raises a number of really interesting challenges around monetary policy. So basically, are you in an inflationary economy or a deflationary economy? Fundamental questions that need to be answered if you want to move to a truly digital currency. If you're interested in that question, the Bank of England has put out a massive research agenda, and it's publicly available. It's very, very interesting to look at. So, blockchain is really about trust, or at least it is sold to us currently about trust. So what is our traditional approach to trust in our industrial economy? Generally, we create trust through intermediaries. That's generally how we do it today. So why do you trust that a krona is actually valid currency? That's actually a question. Sorry, I'm somebody who engages with my audience. That's actually a question. Okay, why do you think, if I give you 20 krona, how do you know that it's something that you can trust? Okay, I'll loan you 1 million krona then. On a piece of, basically, I think we trust it because it says Riksbanken on it, right? So we've got in every country in the world we have central banks that provide trust in the currency. Then it says that this is actually a pound, and I promise if I give you this note, you'll be able to get money later in the future, or you'll be able to exchange it for value. So a bank is a very common one. Also, lawyers are considered intermediaries in many places. So if I want to sign a contract, let's say a very basic NDA, I will get a lawyer to check that. Many people feel that blockchain can actually remove the need for lawyers in that case. So we have a lot of lawyers coming into the centre very worried because they've realised that blockchain is going to change their business model from a charge per hour basis to a charge per contract basis. And they've suddenly realised they're going to be quite poor if they actually charge according to that model. A favourite one of many people is to get rid of the real estate agent. So if I can exchange a contract with you on the blockchain, so I give you my house and we agree a price, we record that onto the blockchain, and we just don't need to go to a real estate agent. It's everything is handled automatically because it's publicly and transparently stored. And then the final one, which is a little bit more complex, is a company, as I said before, is actually an intermediary. It's a form of intermediary that we've created to allow massive industrial systems to emerge globally. So blockchain, the premise is, can we remove intermediaries and replace them with digitalized trust? So let's see. So what is a blockchain? I'm going to go through this quickly because it seems you guys know this quite well. So a blockchain allows untrusting parties with common interests to co-create a permanent, unchangeable, transparent record of exchange and processing without relying on a central authority. So effectively, we're relying on digital technologies to give us a bit of a strange approach to something, to trust. So I'm going to say that I don't trust any of you to record my financial transactions. So I'm going to share my financial information with all of you so everyone else can check. Everyone else is going to check that those transactions are validated correctly. So effectively, by trusting no one, we create trust. So it's a counterintuitive way of thinking about trust, really. So, for example, one thing to note is blockchain and distributed ledger are often used interchangeably, at least in the UK. So if you hear those two phrases, they're slightly different things, but we can... So what does blockchain provide? Truth, I question that. A lot of people say it gives us a new form of truth. I question, what is truth? I don't think we can get that from digital technologies. Transparency, so we get radical transparency over transactions. We can have radical transparency over what the government is spending. There's a big push to use distributed ledgers and blockchain in the UK government. in order to get very radical transparency over what is actually happening, who's spending the money, what they're spending it on. And also trust. Mainly the trust comes through integrity. So by creating a mutable transactional record, you're able to create trust. And there's three main ways that a blockchain does this. Firstly, it does it through consensus. And the consensus is a technical protocol, basically, that prevents double spend or validation of fraudulent transactions. There's a couple of different ways to do that, and I'm sure many of the computer scientists in the room know a variety of different consensus protocols. But the main ones being used within blockchain at the moment are proof of work, and that's where miners are competing to validate blocks of very cryptographically intensive problems. And they do that in order to gain a reward. You have distributed consensus, where majority validation by trusted subnetworks of peer nodes creates the consensus. And then proof of stake. So I'm presuming a lot of people have heard of Ethereum. Yeah? Anyone not heard of Ethereum? Okay, a couple of people. So Ethereum is a type of blockchain that effectively allows you to run something called smart contracts on top. So it's not just about creating the transactional record, but it creates a programmatic interface on top of the blockchain. So the second part of a blockchain or a distributed ledger is the ledger itself. And that's the public record of all transactions across a peer-to-peer network, basically. And verified transactions get added as blocks, and it provides that historical transaction record. It's very similar to a traditional accounting ledger, where effectively you zero off at the end of the page and start a new page. The very big difference between today's database systems and this type of distributed ledger is the historical record. So a database currently provides state of a particular set of transactions, but blockchain gives you a historical record of how everything has transferred. It's very useful for assets, therefore, to see the transfer of ownership of an asset, which gives you some very, very interesting things to play with along a supply chain. So one of the companies that I do some work for is a company called Everledger, and they're using blockchain technology to track and trace diamonds. And the historical transaction records is extremely important, tracking a diamond as it goes from mine all the way through the processing of the diamond into an actual piece of jewelry. The third part of a blockchain is reward, which is the medium for transaction settlement within a network that rewards the miners. So that's what Bitcoin actually is. The financial value is created in order to ensure that there are enough miners in the system to provide a stable network. So the reward ensures that we have enough nodes in the network to create the trust that we need. They're cryptographically generated, and the protocol rules determine how you get the reward. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, and Bitcoin is just one example. And this comes back to the point between the difference between a distributed ledger and a blockchain. You don't need reward of this type in every single type of distributed ledger. They're a key part of public permissionless blockchains where every transaction is publicly available to everybody, but they're not necessarily part of all DLT. The reason that that is important is that Bitcoin and Ethereum and all of these very large public permissionless networks are massively energy intensive. So, for example, Bitcoin takes the entire energy of Denmark at the moment to run its network for what is effectively an experiment in digital currencies. So going forward, if we want to use these in a lot of different industries, we need to find a way to reduce that environmental impact. This is just a very quick example of the blockchain. So if I'm here and I'm transferring money to point B over there, effectively what happens is every single node in the network records that transaction, and everyone can validate that that transaction is correct. As you can see, there's no central point of control. So this is what a blockchain, conceptually actually looks like. And actually what you can see is that periodically every transaction is wrapped as a block and they're linked together. So that's how you get the blockchain, basically. So there's a very large range of digital or distributed ledger technologies. We start on the far left. my far left, which is databases, which are the very traditional databases that we know today. And then we have the 3 different types of distributed ledger, which start on the right here with permissionless public shared systems, so everybody can create a transaction and become a part of the network, and everyone can read the transaction. So you don't need to be part of the network to read the transactions. So that's Bitcoin, Ethereum, those kind of things. And then you have 2 different types of public shared systems and private shared systems, which is about whitelisting, basically. So you can have a distributed ledger, which is private, and you can whitelist access to that, so only the participants in that network can actually see the records. So for example, that's used by banks. So there's something called Corda coming out of the R3 system, out of R3 consortium, which is effectively a private distributed ledger, which is used in the banking systems. As I said before, blockchain is much bigger than Bitcoin. This is an example that's come from City Ventures and some work done with the professor of the center, which is looking at the complete range of where blockchain is actually able to be used. So it can be used for multiple different types of records: currency, assets, contracts, data, and peer-to-peer. And some of the most interesting ones, I think, come around the peer-to-peer collaborative economy, Internet of Things, and this kind of things. But there's also a lot of other areas in supply chain management. DRM is a big one as well, so digital rights management. It's a very good way to track and trace who's using different types of digital media. And yes, I guess others to be determined. So that's for all of the students in the room, you tell us. So basically what's going to happen. And I'll pop through to some examples. So at the center, we work obviously actively with our students, but also with industry and a lot of different sizes of companies. So very large companies, very small companies. And we've done about 38 at the moment proofs of concept of the use of blockchain outside of financial services. So one of these is looking at identity. So who's going to actually own identity? Some examples: show card, and as I mentioned before, ID 2020. So some very interesting pieces of work are coming up in this space that really challenge the way we think about identity and what it means to be a citizen. So for example, ID 2020 at the beginning of, or sort of the end, of 2016 had a lovely big conference with Microsoft where they stood up and said, we're going to take everyone's Outlook ID and we're going to put that on the blockchain, and that will function as your citizen ID, which to me is quite an interesting thing to state. Firstly, I have about 4 different Outlook IDs, so for different places that I work. So my C. Mulligan at imperial.act.uk, is that going to be my central identity? Is it? Why is Microsoft going to be the owner of national identity? My contract as a citizen around national identity has traditionally always been with my government. What does it mean to now have that relationship owned by a company out of Seattle? So these are really foundational challenges to the way we think about how our society is actually structured. And one of the things that we push a lot for is to try and get our students to think beyond just the technology, but also the impact of using these technologies in different fields. Because it's an extremely important thing as an engineer to understand that when you go out into society with all these tools you've been given, you can actually do some really interesting stuff, but you can also create quite a lot of unintended damage. So an example of that at the moment is e-voting. As a more cut-down version, rather than sovereign identity, how do you prove identity when you're voting? So for example, Indonesia is looking at using this to replace their current system, where they are using fingerprints for people to register to vote. But we've also seen smaller examples in the NASDAQ and the Estonian stock market, where they're pretty much moving to using a distributed ledger to do their voting already today. This is an example of a proof of concept that we did together with a company called Guardtime, which has a particular type of blockchain. It's a private blockchain. And we looked at how you use distributed ledgers to protect critical infrastructure, which might seem a little bit counterintuitive. But a big problem that we have today with putting IoT into a lot of different devices around the world, in particular our civic infrastructure, is that it can open up our civic infrastructure to hacking. So an example that sort of triggered me to start this student project was basically a friend of mine called up and said, my windmill's been hacked. To which I said, that's a very interesting problem, why are you calling me? But effectively what had happened, they'd noticed one of their wind turbines was no longer functioning effectively in their wind farm. They sent a boat out, they sent someone up to the top of the turbine, and they realized that the software was not in English anymore. It was not their software. They didn't know when it had been changed. They did not know what that software was doing, and they didn't know what else it had done on their network. That's a critical infrastructure. That's electricity. You can do real damage if you can get control over someone's energy network, as the Ukraine, for example, is a brilliant example of that. So what we did was we looked at how you would use blockchain, or in this case KSI, to provide a hash of the firmware of different devices in a utilities network, so a PMU or something like that. The idea being that if you create, for example, a unique hash of that firmware and put it into the blockchain, and that hash then changes at some interval, you poll it at every so often, you know that something has changed on your network. So it's not going to give you a new cybersecurity solution, but it will tell you there's an early warning, there's an early flag or an early warning system that you need to implement your other security procedures. And this sort of idea around protecting critical infrastructure, for me, is really about data integrity as well. So it's about how you prove the integrity of your data. And there's a big difference, I think, between an integrity breach or a confidentiality breach, which is often around privacy. And there's just some examples here. You know, your car, an integrity breach is your braking system just stops working, so you might die. Okay. But confidentiality breach gives you your braking patterns get exposed, so you might get charged more for insurance if it shows that you're a bad driver. Your pacemaker, you know, an integrity breach will kill you again, but your pacemaker, your heartbeat becomes public knowledge, which may or may not be. People may or may not worry about that, but it could lead you, you know, combined with other data, it could create quite a lot of problems for people. And then finally, your home, your security systems could be remotely disabled and someone can break in, but a confidentiality breach will give you, you know, how much beer have you actually drunk? You know, are you actually eligible for a civil service job in the UK? Because they do ask you, you know, how much do you drink? Now they'll be able to know exactly how much you drink by how much beer you put in your fridge and how many times you open it. So I'm just going to finish off on what's something called a DAO, or Distributed Autonomous Corporation or Organization. Has everyone heard of those? Okay, so this is a good thing to finish on. So this is basically the concept of using blockchain to remove the need for people in companies. So if you think about a company today with the CEO, shareholders, all these kind of things, and people, you can actually remove the need for humans at all in a distributed autonomous organization. Now everyone just stares at me blankly when I say this usually, but there are examples of this already running. You can Google them. And they're using it for a very small web service. So the web service has a CEO who, you know, puts money in or takes money out of this company, but effectively the web service knows when it needs to buy bandwidth, and it does it itself. It knows when it needs to allow people access to it and then charge them for that access. It knows when there's something maybe going wrong on the logs and it needs to call for maintenance. So it's a very small test of this, but what does that mean in a bigger sense? So digital rights management is a big one. So for example, film. Here is an example called Aventis, which one of our students did and has spun out as a company. But basically that looks at using individuals to create films, do the recording, do the soundtracks, all of those kind of things as individuals, and then they sell it to a consumer who will buy it, and the money is automatically distributed back down the supply chain. No need for any intermediaries at all. There's no need for Sony, actually. You can remove the need for that. So it's a long way off, but it's worth thinking about what that actually means. Final one that we're working on a little bit now, which I'm sure I'd like to talk about with a few different companies in the room, is this idea of a driverless cryptocurrency-enabled Uber. So if you take Uber, you remove the driver with an autonomous vehicle, but then you replace a lot of things with a cryptocurrency service in the car itself, you've effectively removed the need for a large amount of people in that sort of economic system. So you have an autonomous vehicle, I'll flag it down as a consumer, I'll use it, I'll pay for it using cryptocurrency. The car can know itself when it needs to book in for service, and it will just go to its MOT. So that big 3 triangles is our MOT service, when you go in to get your car fixed yearly. So that's the UK symbol for that. So that's, it's quite a challenging thing to think about for many people, because the first thing people run to is what happens to all the jobs. So that is something to ponder, but this is something that is coming. I think there are some people in the Netherlands that are going to trial this quite shortly, so it could be quite fun to watch. But I'm going to end now on the final question, which is around, again, back to trust. So does blockchain really create digitalized trust? Or does it merely move the locus of trust to a new set of intermediaries? I'm going to give you my thoughts, which would be that I think that it moves trust to a new set of people who are basically coders. They're software engineers. And so my question and my challenge, effectively, to many of the technical universities that I go and speak to is, how are you training your engineers, the next generation, to handle the ethics of what they're actually being equipped to build? I think that's a hugely important challenge for all of the academic community to face together. So thank you. Sorry.
Up here?
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Catherine. And actually, that's where we started yesterday. We started with a presentation by a professor of philosophy and ethics,
oh, cool.
And what would be the equalizer when we're driving change, and who's actually in the intermediary, and what are the new skill sets for a new society, and what are the old skill sets that we need to keep. We are 5 minutes behind schedule, so we don't need to worry. And I see someone waving a hand already in red jacket there. So we'll allow for a few questions. Hang on, you'll get the microphone, then the live stream will hear you too.
Hello. Blockchain is a consensus protocol, which means that it's vulnerable to majority attacks, right? And we know the security is slightly problematic, like 30% of all computers have malware. And we're kind of putting this, if you put citizen blockchains, it's ordinary computers, right? So how do you... Because blockchain kind of rewrites reality in a way, because there's no paper trail that used to be in the same way. So how do you think about that? Because I think it's an amazing technology, but I think that it is a bit scary, and since it's vulnerable, the number of nodes is a bit problematic, especially if you think about, you talked about the problem of power shortages, right? If you have a power shortage, removing parts of the blockchain, it could be vulnerable to attack, for example. So how do you think about securing the history and validating the history of the blockchain to handle those kinds of attacks?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting research question, actually. It is something that, for example, again, the Bank of England have actually asked the research community in the UK to give an answer to, because they are actively looking at how they would use this. I don't actually have any answers yet, but I do know that the research community is working on it. But yes, you're right. It's a brilliant idea. I think you've just given someone a great idea of how to bring down parts of the Bitcoin network. You just use a power attack. Simultaneous attack. We can attack the power network and then attack Bitcoin.
So hang on. Use the microphone.
Sorry. I'm Christina Knaving. So I'm an interaction design researcher. I don't do blockchain, but this, I think, is a natural question, thinking of how it's built.
Okay, thank you. Do we have one more question? Okay, then we will move on to the chocolate. This is our routine. Catherine hang on. Chocolate. And applause. Thank you.